I woke up to find HOA President Patricia Williamson had drained my 3-year lake project with excavators, claiming flood risk, to protect her $1 million neighborhood. She had no idea my lake was actually their flood control system, and a massive storm was heading straight for her house in 3 days. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also like and subscribe for more stories. I woke up that Tuesday morning to the sound of heavy machinery outside my bedroom window. Through the curtains I could see a massive excavator sitting next to my lake, its bucket already biting into the earthen dam I'd spent 3 years building. Standing next to the machine with a clipboard and a satisfied smirk was Patricia Williamson, president of Meadowbrook Hills HOA. My lake was gone. 3 years of work, $20,000 of my own money, and countless hours of labor, all destroyed while I slept. I threw on clothes and ran outside, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass as thousands of gallons of water rushed past me toward the storm drains. The lake that had been my pride and joy, home to bass, bluegill and countless waterfowl, was now nothing but a muddy crater. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted over the noise of the excavator. Patricia looked up from her clipboard with mock surprise. "Oh, David. Good morning. We're just taking care of that flood risk you created." The HOA board voted unanimously to have your illegal pond removed for the safety of the community. Illegal pond? I have permits for this lake. I followed every regulation. Patricia's smile turned predatory. "Well, that may have been true when you built it, but new regulations have come into effect. This body of water poses an unacceptable flood risk to downstream properties." I stared at this woman in disbelief. Patricia Williamson was everything wrong with suburban HOAs wrapped up in one perfectly manicured package. Blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer clothes that cost more than most people's cars, and a sense of entitlement that could be seen from space. What downstream properties? My lake drains into the storm system, same as everyone's gutters. "That's not how our engineering consultant sees it," Patricia replied smugly. "According to his report, your pond could overflow during heavy rains and flood the Berkshire section of our community." The Berkshire section was where Patricia lived, along with the other board members and the wealthiest residents of Meadowbrook Hills. Their houses sat on the highest ground in the development, a full quarter-mile away from my property. "Patricia, that's physically impossible. Water doesn't flow uphill." "Don't take that tone with me, David. The board has spoken and the work is proceeding under emergency authority. You should have thought about community safety before you decided to play with hydrology." I watched helplessly as 3 years of work disappeared down the storm drains. My lake had been more than just a water feature. It was an ecosystem. Ducks nested there every spring. Kids from the neighborhood came to fish. During summer evenings, families would gather on my dock to watch the sunset reflect off the water. Now it was all gone because Patricia Williamson had decided it threatened her property values. "The excavation will be finished by noon," Patricia continued. "You're responsible for cleaning up any remaining debris and restoring the area to original grade. The HOA will be monitoring compliance closely. This is my property. You can't just destroy my lake without my permission." Patricia pulled a thick folder from her briefcase. "Actually, David, we can. Emergency flood mitigation falls under our authority to protect community safety. It's all here in black and white." She handed me a copy of the emergency order, signed by all 5 HOA board members and stamped with an official-looking seal. According to the document, my lake posed an imminent threat to community safety and required immediate remediation. "You filed this emergency order without notifying me?" Emergency orders don't require individual notification when community safety is at stake. "Really, David, you should read your HOA agreements more carefully." I had read the HOA agreements, cover to cover, multiple times. There was nothing in there about emergency pond removal or unilateral property modification. But Patricia was betting I wouldn't fight back, just like all the other residents she'd bulldozed over the years. She was wrong. That evening, I sat in my empty backyard staring at the muddy crater where my lake used to be. The excavator had done thorough work. Not only had they drained the water and removed the dam, they'd also destroyed my dock, my fish habitat structures, and 3 years' worth of aquatic plants. My neighbor Jim walked over with 2 beers and the kind of expression people wear at funerals. "David, I'm sorry about your lake. Patricia's been planning this for months." "Planning it? What do you mean?" Jim sat down heavily in one of my patio chairs. "She's been talking about it at the board meetings. Says your pond makes the neighborhood look rustic and hurts property values. The flood risk thing is just an excuse." "But the engineering report." "What engineering report?" Patricia's brother-in-law is a civil engineer. He wrote a one-page memo saying your pond could potentially cause flooding. That's not a real engineering study. I felt my anger building. So she destroyed my lake to improve her property values? David, Patricia's been trying to get rid of anything in this neighborhood that doesn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. Remember the Thompsons' vegetable garden? The Martinez family's playset? The community bulletin board? I remembered. Over the past 2 years, Patricia had systematically eliminated anything that made Meadowbrook Hills feel like a real community instead of a sterile showcase. What can I do? She says the HOA has emergency authority. Jim laughed bitterly. Emergency authority, my ass. The HOA constitution requires a community vote for any major expenditure or property modification. Patricia just decided she was above the rules. Then why didn't anyone stop her? Because most people are afraid of her. She sued 3 families in the past year for violations. Spent their savings on legal fees even when she lost. People would rather keep quiet than fight. That night, I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen who specialized in property law. After I explained the situation, there was a long silence on the phone. David, what Patricia did is almost certainly illegal. HOAs don't have the authority to destroy private property improvements without due process, regardless of what they claim about emergency powers. So I can sue her? You can sue and you'll probably win. But it'll take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. Patricia knows this. She's betting you won't fight because the legal costs aren't worth it. What if I want to fight anyway? Another pause. Then we'll need to be smart about it. Patricia's weakness is that she thinks she's untouchable. People like that tend to make bigger and bigger mistakes until they finally cross a line they can't uncross. What kind of line? The kind that destroys other people's property and violates federal regulations. Keep documenting everything, David. Patricia will hang herself eventually. Lisa was right, but I wasn't willing to wait years for justice. I wanted Patricia to understand what it felt like to have someone else control your property and your life. That's when I remembered something from my college engineering classes about watershed management and storm drainage systems. Meadowbrook Hills was built in a natural valley with carefully designed drainage that channeled rainwater from the surrounding hills through a series of culverts and storm drains. My lake had been part of that system, acting as a retention pond that slowed water flow during heavy rains. Without my lake, all that water now went directly into the storm drains at full speed. The next morning, I drove to the county engineering office and requested the original drainage plans for Meadowbrook Hills. What I found was fascinating. The development's storm drainage system had been designed around my lake. The original plans showed my property as a natural retention area that would moderate peak flows during storm events. Removing my lake didn't just eliminate a pretty water feature. It fundamentally altered the hydrology of the entire community. More importantly, I learned that any modification to the storm drainage system required county approval and environmental review. Patricia's emergency order was not only illegal under HOA rules, it violated county regulations and possibly federal wetlands protection laws. But I wasn't ready to play the legal card yet. I had a better idea. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly surveyed the storm drainage system throughout Meadowbrook Hills. I traced every culvert, mapped every drain, and identified exactly where the water from my former lake was now going. Most of it flowed directly under the Berkshire section, where Patricia and the other board members lived. The storm drains in that area were old and undersized. They'd been adequate when my lake slowed the water flow, but now they were handling triple the volume at much higher speed. During the next heavy rain, those drains were going to back up. The weather forecast showed a major storm system approaching in 3 days. I spent those 3 days making modifications to my property's drainage. Nothing illegal, just some strategic landscaping that would direct water flow in more efficient directions. I also cleaned out some debris from the culverts on my property, improving their flow capacity dramatically. The night before the storm, I drove through Meadowbrook Hills one last time, checking my calculations. Everything looked perfect. The storm hit at 3 a.m. on a Thursday. I'd been awake for hours, listening to the rain intensify and watching the weather radar on my phone. By 4 a.m., we'd received 3 inches in 2 hours, exactly the kind of deluge that my lake used to handle easily. At 4:30 a.m., my phone started buzzing with emergency alerts from the county flood warning system. At 5 a.m., the first 911 call started going out from the Berkshire section. I made coffee and sat on my covered porch, watching nature reclaim what Patricia Williamson had stolen from her. The water came in waves. First, just puddles in the low-lying areas. Then standing water in the streets. By 6 a.m., the storm drains in the Berkshire section were backing up, sending thousands of gallons of muddy water streaming across manicured lawns and into million-dollar homes. Patricia's house, sitting at what she thought was the highest and safest point in the development, was actually in a natural depression that funneled storm water. Without my lake to slow the flow, her basement filled with 4 feet of muddy water in less than an hour. The irony was beautiful. Patricia had destroyed my lake to prevent flooding, and her actions had caused the worst flood in Meadowbrook Hills history. By 7 a.m., 12 homes in the Berkshire section had significant flood damage. The fire department had responded to multiple calls about basement flooding, electrical problems, and water damage. The storm drains were completely overwhelmed, and water was flowing through the neighborhood like a river. My phone rang at 7:15. It was Patricia and she sounded hysterical. "David, you have to help us. The flooding is terrible. Half the Berkshire section is underwater." "Gee, Patricia, that's terrible. Almost like removing that flood control pond was a bad idea." "What are you talking about? Your pond couldn't have prevented this." "Actually, Patricia, it could have. See, my lake was designed as a retention pond to manage storm water flow. By removing it, you eliminated the primary flood control for your section of the development." There was a long silence. "Are you saying this flood is because we drained your pond?" "I'm saying hydrology is complicated, and maybe you should have consulted actual engineers before making emergency decisions about water management. Fix this. Right now. Rebuild your pond or we'll sue you." I laughed. "Sue me for what? Following your emergency order? You're the one who created this flooding problem, Patricia. You get to live with the consequences." I hung up and poured another cup of coffee. The flooding continued for 6 hours as the storm system stalled over our area. By the time the rain stopped, the Berkshire section looked like a disaster zone. Muddy water had damaged foundations, ruined landscaping, and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of property. Patricia's basement had taken the worst hit. Her finished recreation room, wine cellar, and home theater were completely destroyed. The water had been so deep it had reached her main electrical panel, requiring complete rewiring of the house. But the real damage was to Patricia's reputation and authority. By noon, news crews were interviewing residents about the flooding. Several neighbors mentioned that the problem started after the HOA drained David Morrison's retention pond without proper engineering review. The County Flood Control Office issued a statement that afternoon. Unauthorized modifications to storm drainage systems can have serious consequences for community safety. Property owners should consult with qualified engineers before altering natural water retention areas. Patricia tried to control the narrative, claiming the flooding was an unprecedented weather event, unrelated to the pond removal. But too many people understood the connection between cause and effect. The next morning, I found Patricia standing in my backyard, staring at the empty crater where my lake used to be. She looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her perfect hair was limp, her designer clothes were wrinkled, and her usual arrogant confidence was gone. "David, we need to talk." "About what, Patricia?" About restoring your pond. The board has reconsidered our position on the flood risk." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Patricia, you can't just turn hydrology on and off like a light switch. My lake took 3 years to build properly. The ecosystem took another 2 years to establish. You destroyed all of that in one morning. We'll pay for restoration. Whatever it costs. It's not about money, Patricia. You violated my property rights, ignored environmental regulations, and lied about engineering reports. Then you acted surprised when your illegal actions had consequences." Patricia's composure finally cracked. "Please, David. My house is ruined. My insurance company is saying the flooding might not be covered because it was caused by man-made alterations to natural drainage patterns. If they don't pay, I'll lose everything." I looked at this woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood with her petty tyranny and fake authority. 3 days ago, she'd been untouchable. Now she was begging for help from the man whose property she'd destroyed. "Patricia, you spent years bullying people who couldn't fight back. You used fear and intimidation to control other people's property. You thought you were above the rules because you had money and connections." I know. I made mistakes." "No, Patricia. You didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to abuse your authority. You chose to ignore regulations. You chose to destroy my property without due process. What do you want? Money? I'll resign from the board. Just help me fix this." I walked to the edge of my empty lake and looked down at the muddy crater. Fish bones and dead plants were scattered across the bottom like a graveyard. Patricia, I want my lake back. The way it was. With the ecosystem intact and the wildlife restored. I want a written apology to every family you've harassed over the years. And I want you to publicly admit that you violated HOA rules, county regulations, and my property rights. Fine. Yes. Whatever you want. But first, I want you to explain to the news crews exactly how removing a flood control pond caused flooding in your neighborhood. Patricia's face went pale. David, please. If I admit fault publicly, my insurance definitely won't cover the damage. Then you'll understand how it feels to have someone else's decisions destroy your property and your financial security. That afternoon, Patricia held a press conference in front of her flooded house. With news cameras rolling, she admitted that the HOA had illegally removed a retention pond that served as flood control for the community. We acted hastily and without proper engineering review, she said, reading from a prepared statement. The flooding damage to our neighborhood was a direct result of our poor decision-making. We take full responsibility for the consequences. The story made local news that evening. HOA president admits illegal pond removal caused neighborhood flooding. Within a week, Patricia faced lawsuits from 8 families whose homes had flood damage. The county environmental office opened an investigation into unpermitted modifications to the storm drainage system. The state attorney general's office launched a review of HOA emergency powers. But the most satisfying consequence was watching Patricia lose her grip on the community she terrorized for years. A group of residents organized a recall election for the entire HOA board. They cited Patricia's illegal use of emergency powers, failure to follow HOA bylaws, and destruction of private property without due process. The recall election was held 3 weeks after the flood. Patricia and 4 other board members were removed from office by a vote of 89 to 12. The new board's first official action was to authorize full restoration of my lake at HOA expense. They also passed new rules requiring community votes for any major property modifications and independent engineering review for all drainage projects. Patricia's house took 4 months to repair. Her insurance company initially denied coverage, forcing her to pay for restoration out of pocket. She eventually received partial reimbursement, but only after agreeing to install additional flood prevention measures at her own expense. 6 months after the flood, my lake was restored and restocked with fish. The new HOA board had hired a legitimate engineering firm to design proper flood controls and ensure the system would work as intended. The lake dedication ceremony was held on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Families throughout Meadowbrook Hills came to celebrate the restoration of their community's flood control system and the return of their favorite fishing spot. Patricia didn't attend. She'd put her house on the market the previous month and moved to another state. As I stood on my rebuilt dock watching kids cast fishing lines into the clear water, I thought about the difference between authority and power. Patricia had authority, official position, legal documents, board votes. But real power comes from understanding systems and consequences. She thought she could control nature by destroying my lake. Instead, she learned that water follows its own rules, regardless of HOA bylaws. The new board president, a retired engineer named Robert Park, walked over to where I was standing. David, I owe you an apology on behalf of the entire community. What Patricia did was wrong and we should have stopped her sooner. Robert, you couldn't have known she'd go this far. Patricia spent years escalating her abuse of power. This was just the first time she picked on someone who understood the consequences. Still, she destroyed 3 years of your work. I looked at the lake, now deeper and more beautiful than it had ever been. Ducks were already returning, and I'd seen signs of beaver activity near the far shore. Actually, Robert, she gave me something better than my original lake. She gave me a community that understands the difference between leadership and tyranny. That evening, I sat on my dock with a beer, watching the sunset reflect off the water. My lake was home again to bass, bluegill, and countless waterfowl. Kids from the neighborhood were already making plans for summer fishing trips. Most importantly, Meadowbrook Hills felt like a real community again instead of Patricia Williamson's personal kingdom. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's letting natural consequences teach the lesson for you. Patricia had spent years controlling other people through fear and intimidation. In the end, she was defeated by something she couldn't control, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't sue: gravity. Water always finds its way home. And bullies always create their own downfall. The lake was back, the fish were biting, and justice had been served 1 gallon at a time.